Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Blackwater County, Montana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrived. The case of Sheriff Elias Thornwood has remained buried in the archives of the Montana Historical Society since 1957, when the last official investigation was abruptly closed. What follows is a compilation of newspaper clippings, county records, personal journals, and testimonies from the few remaining witnesses who agreed to speak about what happened in Blackwater County between 1932 and 1936. The events described herein challenge our understanding of justice, power, and the darkness that can consume even those sworn to protect. Winter came early to Blackwater County in 1932. The mountain passes were already draped in snow by mid-October, effectively isolating the remote mining community from the rest of Montana until spring. This isolation had always been a fact of life for the residents, but that year, the seclusion would prove more consequential than anyone could have imagined. Sheriff Elias Thornwood had been elected to his position just 6 months prior, running unopposed after the previous sheriff died of pneumonia. Thornwood was a man of few words, described by most as stern but fair. He'd served in the Great War and returned with a rigid sense of right and wrong that seemed to comfort the townspeople during those uncertain economic times. The Blackwater County Historical Society records show that Thornwood initially gained popularity through his handling of local disputes and his strict enforcement of prohibition laws, though it was noted that he seemed to turn a blind eye to the operations of the Maxwell family, who ran the largest bootlegging operation in the county from their property deep in the Blackwater woods. According to tax records from the period, the Maxwell family owned nearly 2,000 acres of densely forested land that stretched to the county line. The patriarch, Harold Maxwell, had made his fortune in timber before diversifying into less legal ventures during Prohibition. Local newspapers from late 1932 describe a meeting between Sheriff Thornwood and Harold Maxwell that lasted several hours at the Maxwell estate. No record exists of what was discussed, but in the weeks that followed, Thornwood was observed making regular visits to the property. Some speculated about corruption, while others suggested Thornwood was gathering evidence for a major arrest. Neither theory would prove entirely accurate. On December 17, 1932, the first disappearance occurred. Jeremiah Holcomb, a drifter who had been staying at the boarding house in town, was reported missing by the proprietress after he failed to return for 3 consecutive nights. In her statement to Deputy Sheriff Collins, she mentioned that Holcomb had boasted about finding work with the Maxwells just days before. When questioned, Harold Maxwell confirmed that Holcomb had applied for work but claimed the man never showed up for his first day. The case was noted in the county records as resolved, subject likely moved on, a common conclusion for transients during those Depression years. Over the following months, a pattern emerged. 7 more individuals disappeared from Blackwater County, all men with minimal connections to the community, all last seen heading toward or returning from the direction of the Maxwell property. Each case was investigated by Sheriff Thornwood personally, and each was eventually closed with minimal documentation. What's notable in retrospect is that none of the disappearances generated significant concern among the townspeople. In a recorded interview conducted in 1951, former town council member Walter Jenkins offered this insight. Times were hard, people came and went, and if they were the sort who dealt with the Maxwells, well, no one asked too many questions. The winter of 1933 was particularly harsh in Blackwater County. Heavy snowfall collapsed the roof of the Methodist Church, and food shortages led to community rationing. According to personal diaries from residents of the period, Sheriff Thornwood organized hunting parties that kept the town fed through February. Harold Maxwell contributed generously to these efforts, providing venison and preserved foods from his seemingly abundant stores. Those who encountered him described a man increasingly distant, his eyes holding what one witness called a 1,000-yard stare that never quite focused on you. He began keeping unusual hours, often riding out alone at dusk and returning before dawn, his uniform sometimes bearing strange stains that his deputy later described as dark, like old rust. The county expense ledger shows that Thornwood requisitioned unusual items during this period: large quantities of salt, specialized tools from the blacksmith, and chemical compounds from the apothecary that were typically used for preserving animal specimens. The sheriff and the bootlegger were often seen in deep conversation during town meetings, their previous public animosity apparently forgotten. By spring, something had changed in Sheriff Thornwood. In June 1933, Harold Maxwell's youngest son, Frederick, returned from college in California. According to several accounts, the young man was horrified by what he discovered at the family estate. No record exists of what exactly Frederick witnessed, but on June 14th, he arrived at the sheriff's office in a state of extreme distress. Deputy Collins was the only person present during their conversation, and his subsequent statement indicates that Frederick made allegations against both his father and Sheriff Thornwood, accusations that Collins found too fantastical to be credible. Frederick Maxwell was found deceased 3 days later in his room at the family estate. The cause was officially recorded as suicide, though the coroner's report noted several inconsistencies, including defensive wounds on his hands and a peculiar odor emanating from his mouth and nostrils. Sheriff Thornwood personally oversaw the investigation and declared the case closed within 24 hours. Harold Maxwell did not attend his son's funeral. The following month saw a dramatic shift in the power dynamics of Blackwater County. On July 22, 1933, Sheriff Thornwood arrived at the Maxwell estate with 3 deputies and a warrant. Harold Maxwell and his 4 remaining sons were arrested on charges of multiple murders, though the specific victims were not named in any public record. What happened next was pieced together from fragmented accounts decades later. The Maxwell men were not taken to the county jail, but instead to an abandoned mining office on the edge of town that Thornwood had converted into what he called his chamber of true justice. For 7 days, the Maxwells were held in this location. No visitors were permitted, and Deputy Collins later testified that he was ordered to stay away from the building. When Sheriff Thornwood finally emerged, he appeared gaunt and exhausted, but, according to witnesses, strangely satisfied. The Maxwell men were then transported to the county courthouse for what would become known locally as the judgment. The court proceedings on July 30, 1933 were closed to the public, with only the judge, a court clerk, and Sheriff Thornwood present. The transcript of this hearing was sealed by judicial order and reportedly destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1942. However, the court clerk, Thomas Avery, kept a personal journal in which he described what transpired that day. This journal remained hidden among family papers until 1956, when Avery's granddaughter discovered it while settling his estate. According to Avery's account, Sheriff Thornwood presented evidence that the Maxwell family had been responsible for at least 22 disappearances over a period of 15 years. The victims were primarily people who had discovered their illegal operations or rival bootleggers attempting to move into their territory. Most disturbing, however, was Thornwood's claim that the Maxwells had engaged in ritualistic consumption of their victims' vital essence, believing it would grant them protection from the law. Avery's journal describes how Thornwood then proceeded to detail his own investigation, including his discovery of human remains on Maxwell property and his infiltration of their operation under the guise of corruption. The judge, apparently overwhelmed by the evidence and Thornwood's intensity, granted the sheriff's unusual request for traditional justice, a term not defined in any legal context of the time. What followed has been pieced together from multiple sources, none entirely reliable on their own. On the morning of July 31, 1933, the Maxwell men were led in chains to the town square. A crowd gathered, drawn by rumors and the unusual spectacle. Sheriff Thornwood addressed the assembled citizens, though no verbatim record of his speech exists. Multiple witnesses later recalled the general theme, that conventional justice was insufficient for the magnitude of the Maxwells' crimes, and that their punishment would fit their particular depravity. 5 wooden chairs had been arranged in a circle, and each Maxwell was secured to one. Sheriff Thornwood then produced 5 metal cups, which he placed before each man. According to several witnesses, he announced that each cup contained a ritual substance, specifically the essence of family members whom the Maxwells had previously betrayed or sacrificed in their ceremonies. Whether this claim was literally true remains impossible to verify, though later analysis suggests Thornwood may have collected vital fluids from the recently deceased Frederick Maxwell and potentially other family members who had died under suspicious circumstances over the years. What is documented in multiple accounts is that Sheriff Thornwood then compelled each Maxwell to drink from the cup before him, informing them that refusing would result in immediate consequences. Harold Maxwell reportedly went first, maintaining eye contact with Thornwood as he drained his cup. His sons followed, some weeping, others stoic. Within minutes, all 5 men began showing signs of distress. Their bodies reacted to the substance with visible discomfort and respiratory difficulty. By noon, the ritual was complete, and none of the Maxwell men survived. The official cause was recorded as unexplained medical complications, though rumors persisted that the cups had contained not just familial essence, but some form of toxic substance. Sheriff Thornwood ordered the bodies buried in unmarked graves on unconsecrated ground beyond the town cemetery. No further examination was performed, and no charges were ever filed against Thornwood for his actions. In the months that followed, Sheriff Thornwood's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Deputy Collins noted in his personal correspondence that the sheriff would disappear for days at a time, returning disheveled and sometimes wounded. When questioned, Thornwood would only say he was continuing his work. Town council minutes from October 1933 record a contentious meeting where several citizens expressed concern about the sheriff's methods, particularly his increasingly frequent arrests for minor infractions and the harsh punishments he imposed. By December, rumors began circulating about strange sounds coming from the abandoned mining office that Thornwood still maintained as his chamber of justice. Local Dr. William Hargrove was called there on at least 3 occasions, though he refused to discuss what he witnessed inside. His medical logs, discovered decades later, contain cryptic references to procedures inconsistent with medical practice and evidence of methodical extraction of essence. On February 3, 1934, Sheriff Thornwood called an unusual town meeting. According to multiple accounts, he arrived looking more composed than he had in months, dressed in a clean uniform with his badge polished to a high shine. He spoke for nearly an hour, though, again, no verbatim record exists. Witnesses recalled that his address centered on the nature of evil and justice, and how conventional law was insufficient to combat true wickedness. Several people noted that Thornwood repeatedly referred to himself as the instrument of true judgment, and spoke of having received guidance from beyond mortal authority. At the conclusion of his speech, Thornwood announced his intention to expand his approach to justice throughout the county and beyond, declaring that corruption existed in every corner of society. He then deputized 12 men on the spot, all described as devoted followers who had been assisting him in his extra-legal activities. The mayor attempted to intervene, questioning Thornwood's authority to create what amounted to a private militia, but was physically removed from the meeting. The following day, County Judge Martin Blackwell sent an urgent telegram to the state capitol requesting intervention. 3 state police officers arrived in Blackwater County on February 8th, but they never returned to Helena. Their abandoned vehicle was discovered at the county line a week later, with no sign of the officers themselves. This triggered a larger response. On February 20th, 1934, a detachment of 15 state police officers accompanied by a federal marshal arrived in Blackwater County. They found Sheriff Thornwood seated calmly at his desk in the county courthouse, his deputies nowhere to be seen. According to the marshal's report, Thornwood surrendered without resistance, stating only that the work is already done. When asked to clarify, he reportedly smiled and said nothing more. A search of the abandoned mining office revealed evidence of multiple incidents, including ritual implements with dark residue, restraints, and what appeared to be ceremonial items of unknown purpose. Most disturbing were journals in Thornwood's handwriting that detailed his procedures, though the specific contents were deemed too unsettling for inclusion in official reports. What is known is that investigators found references to at least 37 individuals who had been subjected to Thornwood's justice, a number far exceeding the known disappearances in the county. Perhaps most unsettling was the discovery that Thornwood had been systematically collecting and preserving vital essence from those he judged, apparently believing that consuming it would transfer their essence to him. His journals indicated that he had forced some to drink the essence of others before their own judgment, as part of what he termed the circle of judgment. This macabre ritual had clearly begun with the Maxwells, but had evolved into something more elaborate and delusional over time. Sheriff Elias Thornwood was transported to the Montana State Hospital for the criminally insane, where he remained silent during most of his evaluation. The examining psychiatrist noted that Thornwood appeared to believe he had been divinely appointed to deliver a new form of justice, one that required the literal consumption of moral essence. Whether this belief predated his confrontation with the Maxwells or emerged as a result of what he discovered about their crimes remains a subject of debate among those who have studied the case. On April 12, 1934, Thornwood escaped from the state hospital during a power outage. Despite an extensive manhunt, he was not recaptured. Sightings were reported across Montana and neighboring states over the following months, but none could be confirmed. Some of Thornwood's deputies were eventually located and arrested, though they claimed to have been coerced into assisting him and provided little useful information about his possible whereabouts. For nearly 2 years, the case remained open but inactive. Then, on January 17, 1936, a package arrived at the Blackwater County Courthouse addressed to those who follow. Inside was a journal containing what appeared to be Thornwood's final testament. The document rambled across nearly 100 pages, alternating between lucid reflection and disturbing fantasies. In the more coherent passages, Thornwood expressed regret for what he called methodological errors, but maintained his conviction that his approach to justice was necessary in a corrupt world. The final pages described Thornwood's plan to continue his work in a more systematic way, suggesting he had established some form of organization to carry on his mission. The journal was signed Elias Thornwood, First Servant of True Justice, and dated January 10, 1936. 1 week after the journal's arrival, a remote cabin in the Bitterroot Mountains was destroyed in what investigators later determined was a deliberate detonation. Human remains found at the site were too fragmentary for identification at the time, though later analysis suggested they belonged to at least 3 individuals. The case was officially closed in March 1936, with authorities concluding that Thornwood had likely perished in the explosion after possibly taking additional victims. The town of Blackwater gradually recovered from the ordeal, though many residents relocated in the years that followed. The Maxwell property was eventually claimed by the county for unpaid taxes and remained abandoned, as no buyer could be found willing to purchase land with such a grim history. In 1957, a graduate student researching frontier justice discovered references to the Thornwood case in state archives and attempted to conduct interviews with surviving witnesses. After 3 months of research, the student abruptly abandoned the project, citing ethical concerns, and personal safety considerations. His collected materials were donated to the Montana Historical Society under the condition that they remain sealed for 50 years. When the files were finally opened in 2007, researchers discovered that several key documents were missing, including photographs, certain witness statements, and the original copy of Thornwood's final journal. A handwritten note dated 1968 indicated that these items had been removed by order of a federal agency whose name had been redacted. No explanation was provided for this intervention, and subsequent inquiries have been unsuccessful in locating the missing materials. What remains are fragments of a story that defies easy explanation, a case where justice and vengeance became so intertwined that they created something entirely different and infinitely more disturbing. Did Sheriff Thornwood begin with noble intentions that were corrupted by exposure to the Maxwells' depravity, or was he always harboring the potential for such extreme methods, merely waiting for an opportunity to implement them? The answers likely died with him somewhere in the mountains of western Montana. Some in Blackwater County still speak of Thornwood in hushed tones, not as a murderer, but as something more complex, a force of nature perhaps, or the embodiment of justice in its most primal form. Others maintain that he was simply a man broken by war and then driven to madness by the horrors he uncovered in his community. Whatever the truth, the legacy of the sheriff who made the guilty consume their own wickedness continues to cast a long shadow over Blackwater County. In 1962, during renovations of the old courthouse, workers discovered a sealed compartment behind a wall in what had been Thornwood's office. Inside was a single metal cup, similar to those described in accounts of the Maxwell's ritual, along with a note in Thornwood's handwriting. It contained just 5 words: "Justice flows through the essence." The cup was sent to a laboratory for analysis, but the results were never made public. According to former county clerk Marion Whitley, who was interviewed in 1965, the cup was subsequently claimed by men identifying themselves as federal agents, who provided no receipt and left no record of their visit. When asked if she believed the Thornwood case was truly closed, Whitley reportedly said, "Some doors once opened can never really be shut again. They can only be hidden behind newer walls." To this day, hikers in the Bitterroot Range occasionally report finding strange markings carved into trees, a circle containing 5 smaller circles said to represent Thornwood's concept of the circle of judgment. Park rangers dismiss these as modern hoaxes, but local guides refuse to approach areas where such markings have been spotted. Perhaps most troubling are the unsolved cases that have occurred in the region in the decades since Thornwood's disappearance, cases involving missing persons and occasionally individuals found in remote locations, their bodies bearing evidence of ritualistic elements. While no direct connection has ever been established, some investigators have noted similarities to the methodology described in Thornwood's recovered writings. The true extent of what occurred in Blackwater County may never be fully known. Records have been lost or deliberately obscured. Witnesses have passed away, and the landscape itself has changed as nature reclaims abandoned structures. What remains is the haunting possibility that Sheriff Elias Thornwood's twisted concept of justice didn't die with him, but instead took root in the remote corners of the Mountain West, a legacy passed down through ritual just as he intended. And perhaps somewhere, in a place beyond the reach of conventional law, the circle of judgment continues, serving a form of justice that flows with the crimson essence of retribution. For some crimes, Thornwood believed the only fitting punishment was to consume the darkness one had created. In Blackwater County, they still lock their doors more securely when the wind blows from the direction of the old Maxwell property. Some fears, like some stains, never truly fade away. They merely sink deeper, becoming part of the foundation upon which everything else is built. The last known photograph of Sheriff Elias Thornwood, taken in January 1934, shows a man transformed from the stern but fair officer elected by hopeful townspeople. His eyes reflect something that the photographer later described as neither fully human nor entirely something else. Perhaps that is the true horror of the Blackwater County case. Not that a monster came to town wearing a badge, but that a man dedicated to justice could become something unrecognizable when he stared too long into the abyss of human depravity. And in that transformation lies a warning that echoes through the decades. Justice without mercy may satisfy our darkest instincts, but it exacts a terrible price from those who administer it. The line between punishing evil and becoming it is far thinner than we might wish to believe. In 1953, an elderly man named Joseph Miller, living in a nursing home in Butte, Montana, claimed to have been one of the witnesses to the Maxwell judgment. According to Miller, Sheriff Thornwood had performed some kind of ritual before presenting the cups, drawing symbols on the ground around each chair and reciting what Miller described as words that weren't English or any language I ever heard. Miller also claimed that when Harold Maxwell drank from his cup, Thornwood placed his hand on the man's head and whispered, "Now we are bound, you and I." Whether Miller's recollections were accurate or the embellishments of an aging mind remains impossible to determine. His account, recorded by a local historian, added several disturbing details not found in other sources. The historian who recorded Miller's account, Dr. Eleanor Simmons, became fascinated by the Thornwood case and spent several years attempting to track down other witnesses. Her research notes, currently housed in the Montana State University archives, reveal a disturbing pattern. Many of those who had been present at key moments in the case experienced unusual fates in the years that followed. Deputy Collins, for example, was found submerged in a creek only 6 inches deep in 1938. Thomas Avery, the court clerk whose journal provided crucial details about the Maxwell's hearing, suffered a sudden cerebral complication the day after turning over his journal to investigators in 1956. Dr. Simmons herself abandoned her research after reporting that she felt she was being watched, and that strange symbols had been carved into her front door. Perhaps the most intriguing lead in Dr. Simmons's notes concerns a man named Robert Thornwood, who she believed might have been a relative of the sheriff. County records confirmed that Elias Thornwood had a younger brother who left Blackwater shortly after Elias assumed the role of sheriff. Dr. Simmons traced Robert to a small town in Idaho, but when she arrived to interview him, she discovered he had relocated without leaving a forwarding address. The landlord of his former residence told Simmons that Robert had received a letter shortly before his departure, after which he became agitated and began packing immediately. The contents of this letter remain unknown. In 1959, a hunter in the Bitterroot Range claimed to have encountered a man living in an isolated cabin who matched Thornwood's description, though by then the sheriff would have been in his 70s. The hunter reported that the man had invited him inside for a meal, but that he had declined, unsettled by the numerous animal skulls mounted on poles around the property and the strange symbols painted on the cabin walls. When authorities investigated 2 weeks later, they found the cabin abandoned, though evidence suggested it had been recently occupied. Among the items left behind was a leather-bound book containing what appeared to be records of individuals who had passed through the area, names, dates, and cryptic notations about their worthiness. The mythology surrounding Thornwood grew in the following decades, particularly among certain fringe groups interested in alternative forms of justice. In 1975, a self-published manuscript titled The Thornwood Method began circulating among militia groups in the Northwest. The text purported to outline Thornwood's philosophy and methodology, though analysis by the FBI determined it contained numerous details inconsistent with the historical record. Nevertheless, between 1975 and 1982, several incidents in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming displayed elements reminiscent of Thornwood's approach, including the forced consumption of ritual substances. No direct connection was ever established, but the similarities were sufficient to prompt a special task force to investigate potential copycat events. One of the most persistent rumors surrounding the case concerns the fate of Thornwood's 12 deputies. While some were arrested and imprisoned after his escape, at least 5 were never located. Local legend suggests that these men formed the core of what Thornwood referred to in his final journal as his organization, a group dedicated to continuing his work. A retired state police officer interviewed in 1984 claimed that law enforcement agencies in the region maintained a classified file on suspected Thornwood followers well into the 1970s, though no official acknowledgement of such surveillance has ever been made. In 1967, a journalist named Michael Brennan published a series of articles about the Thornwood case in the Missoula Sentinel. Brennan had managed to locate and interview several elderly residents of Blackwater County who had direct knowledge of the events. One particularly compelling account came from Sarah Jenkins, who had worked as a housekeeper for the Maxwell family in the early 1930s. According to Jenkins, she had discovered a hidden room in the basement of the Maxwell estate, where Harold Maxwell and his oldest son would take special guests, individuals who were never seen leaving the property. Jenkins claimed she once glimpsed inside this room and saw walls covered with strange symbols and a large stone table with restraints. She quit her position the next day but never reported what she had seen, fearing retribution from the powerful family. Brennan's most controversial assertion was that Thornwood's transformation began not after discovering the Maxwell's crimes, as most accounts suggested, but years earlier during his service in the Great War. Through military records and correspondence with Thornwood's former commanding officer, Brennan established that Thornwood had been part of a specialized unit tasked with infiltrating enemy lines. During one mission, Thornwood and 2 other soldiers were separated from their unit and went missing for 11 days. When they finally returned, the other 2 men were severely traumatized and unable to provide coherent accounts of what had occurred. Thornwood, however, was described as unusually calm and refused to discuss the events of those missing days. Both of his companions were later institutionalized, while Thornwood received a commendation for bravery and was honorably discharged. Brennan suggested that whatever Thornwood experienced during those 11 days fundamentally altered his perception of justice and morality, creating a psychological foundation for the extremes he would later embrace. This theory gained some support from the psychiatric evaluation conducted after Thornwood's arrest, which noted that he displayed characteristics consistent with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, combined with an unusually rigid moral framework. Following the publication of his articles, Brennan planned to expand his investigation into a book. He traveled to several locations across the Northwest, reportedly following leads related to Thornwood's activities after his escape. In September 1968, Brennan's vehicle was discovered abandoned near a hiking trail in Glacier National Park. Despite an extensive search, no trace of the journalist was ever found. His notes and research materials, which he was known to carry with him in a leather satchel, were also missing. The official conclusion was that Brennan had fallen victim to a hiking accident or wildlife encounter, but his family remained convinced that his disappearance was connected to his investigation. In 1972, anthropologist Dr. Rebecca Collins published a paper analyzing the symbolic elements of the Thornwood case. Collins noted striking parallels between Thornwood's circle of judgment concept and certain ancient justice rituals practiced by indigenous cultures in the region. Particularly notable was the similarity to a purification ceremony in which tribal leaders would symbolically consume the essence of wrongdoers to cleanse the community of their influence. Collins speculated that Thornwood might have encountered descriptions of these rituals, perhaps in books or through contact with indigenous individuals, and incorporated elements into his own distorted framework. Her paper raised uncomfortable questions about the cultural appropriation and misinterpretation of indigenous practices, though she emphasized that no traditional ritual remotely resembled the extremes to which Thornwood took his methods. The abandoned Maxwell property remained a subject of local fascination and fear for decades. In 1980, a development company purchased the land with plans to build a vacation resort, citing the pristine forest and mountain views. Construction began in the spring of 1981 but was plagued by accidents and equipment failures. Workers reported unusual phenomena: tools disappearing and reappearing in different locations, unexplained sounds at night, and a persistent feeling of being watched. The project was abandoned after a bulldozer operator uncovered what appeared to be human remains while clearing land for the main lodge. Subsequent archaeological investigation identified at least 17 distinct burial sites, though the condition of the remains made identification impossible. The development company sold the property at a significant loss, and it has remained undeveloped since. In 1992, a true crime author named David Mitchell began researching the Thornwood case for a planned book. Mitchell's approach differed from previous investigators in that he focused not on Thornwood himself, but on the broader context of frontier justice in isolated communities. Through his research, Mitchell uncovered several cases throughout the American West that shared elements with the Blackwater incident, situations where traditional law enforcement broke down and was replaced by extreme, extra-legal forms of justice. Most intriguing was Mitchell's discovery of 3 other incidents between 1890 and 1940, where local officials had forced convicted criminals to consume ritual substances as part of their punishment. None reached the systematic level of Thornwood's methods, but the parallels suggested that his approach, while extreme, was not entirely without precedent. Mitchell also delved into the psychological impact of the case on the community. Through interviews with descendants of Blackwater residents, he documented how the Thornwood incident had created a multi-generational trauma that continued to influence local attitudes toward law enforcement and justice. Many families had simply never discussed what happened, creating what Mitchell termed a conspiracy of silence that allowed the wounds to fester rather than heal. He noted that even 60 years after the events, many residents refused to be named in his book or would speak only off the record, suggesting that the fear associated with the case remained potent. In 1994, Mitchell's research took an unexpected turn when he was contacted by an elderly woman named Margaret Thornwood, who identified herself as Elias Thornwood's niece, the daughter of his brother Robert. According to Margaret, her father had maintained contact with Elias even after the latter's escape from the state hospital. She claimed to possess letters exchanged between the brothers between 1934 and 1936, which she had discovered among her father's effects after his death. Mitchell arranged to meet Margaret at her home in Spokane, Washington, but she passed away suddenly 2 days before the scheduled interview. When Mitchell attempted to locate the letters through Margaret's estate, he was informed that no such documents had been found among her possessions. The question of whether Thornwood acted alone in developing his extreme methodology has remained a subject of debate among criminologists and historians. Some evidence suggests he may have been influenced by or even directly connected to a secretive group that emerged in the Pacific Northwest during the 1920s. This group, which referred to itself as the Justifiers in the few documents that have been recovered, apparently consisted primarily of former law enforcement officers and soldiers who believed that conventional justice systems were inadequate to address the moral decay they perceived in society. While no direct evidence links Thornwood to this organization, certain phrases in his journals closely mirror language found in Justifier texts, and his circle of judgment concept appears in a rudimentary form in a manifesto attributed to the group's founder. The Thornwood case experienced a resurgence of interest in the early 2000s when a popular true crime podcast devoted a 6-episode series to the events in Blackwater County. The podcast reached a much wider audience than previous accounts and generated numerous tips and leads from listeners. Most proved to be dead ends, but one compelling communication came from a retired Forest Service employee who claimed to have discovered a cave in the Bitterroot Range in 1978. that contained items potentially connected to Thornwood. Among these was a badge resembling that of the Blackwater County Sheriff, though with unusual modifications. Most notably, a small circle of 5 dots engraved on its surface. The cave also contained evidence of more recent occupation, suggesting it had been used periodically over many years. The employee had reported his discovery to his supervisors, but was told to leave it undisturbed and not to return to the area. When podcast researchers attempted to locate the cave based on the employee's directions, they found the entire area had been declared off-limits due to environmental concerns. In 2012, historian Dr. James Farrow gained access to previously sealed federal records related to the Thornwood case through a Freedom of Information Act request. These documents revealed that the federal government had taken a much greater interest in the case than was publicly acknowledged at the time. Agents from the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor to the FBI, had been monitoring Thornwood's activities as early as December 1933, following reports of his increasingly extreme methods. Most surprising was the revelation that after Thornwood's escape from the state hospital, he was classified as a priority national security concern, an unusually high designation for what was ostensibly a local criminal matter. The federal documents also contained references to something called Operation Lineage, apparently launched in 1936, shortly after the arrival of Thornwood's final journal. While heavily redacted, the available information suggests this was a coordinated effort to locate and apprehend not just Thornwood himself, but an unspecified number of associates believed to be continuing his work. The operation remained active until 1945, when it was officially terminated due to subject resolution, a bureaucratic phrase that could indicate either Thornwood's death or some other form of conclusion to the case. Curiously, several references in the document suggest that material related to Thornwood's methods was classified and stored in a special archive, with access restricted to individuals with specific clearance. Dr. Farrow's research also unearthed a disturbing epilogue to the Maxwell family story. While Harold Maxwell and his 4 sons met their fate in the town square ritual, there were other family members who survived, most notably Harold's brother Clarence and his family, who had been living in Seattle during the events in Blackwater County. In late 1934, Clarence Maxwell returned to Montana to claim his brother's property, bringing with him his wife and 2 teenage sons. Within 6 months, all 4 members of the family had experienced tragic fates, one son in a hunting accident, the other from a sudden illness, Clarence's wife in a house fire, and Clarence himself from what was ruled a self-inflicted wound. While local authorities treated each incident as unrelated, federal investigators noted patterns consistent with Thornwood's methodology, particularly evidence suggesting that Clarence's wife had been forced to consume some kind of ritual substance before the fire was set. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the federal documents was the implication that Thornwood's influence extended beyond a small circle of direct followers. Several reports described individuals in law enforcement and judicial positions across multiple states who appeared to be employing elements of his philosophy, if not his extreme methods. One internal memo dated 1943 expressed concern about the potential for widespread adoption of T methodology within conventional justice systems, suggesting that aspects of Thornwood's approach were being normalized and integrated into legitimate law enforcement practices. The last substantive entry in the federal files is dated September 1953 and describes the monitoring of a private gathering at a hunting lodge near the Idaho-Montana border. According to the report, approximately 20 individuals attended what appeared to be an annual meeting, arriving separately and taking extensive precautions to avoid surveillance. The agent observing the gathering noted that while the attendees included several prominent community members, including a judge and 2 police chiefs, they performed a ritual upon arrival that involved making a small cut on their palm and adding a drop of their vital essence to a communal cup. The report concludes with a recommendation for ongoing monitoring of ritual practitioners and their professional activities, but no follow-up documents are included in the released files. In 2015, during renovations of an old mining company office building in Helena, construction workers discovered a hidden room containing thousands of pages of documents, photographs, and physical artifacts apparently related to the Thornwood case. The materials appeared to have been collected and organized by someone with access to official records, possibly a law enforcement officer or government official. Most disturbing was a collection of small glass vials, each labeled with a name and date, containing what preliminary analysis indicated was preserved vital essence. The building's owner immediately contacted authorities, and the materials were taken into custody by the Montana State Historical Society in cooperation with law enforcement. Initial examination suggested that the collection represented a comprehensive archive of Thornwood's activities, including detailed records of individuals who had been subjected to his justice, many more than had been previously documented. The archive also contained what appeared to be instructional materials describing Thornwood's methodology in precise detail, as if intended to provide guidance for others wishing to continue his work. Among the most significant discoveries in the Helena archive were several journals apparently written by Thornwood after his escape from the state hospital. These writings revealed that, far from operating in isolation during this period, he had established a network of like-minded individuals across the region, former soldiers, disillusioned lawmen, and others who shared his extreme view of justice. The journals detailed meetings, initiation rituals, and the establishment of what Thornwood termed judgment sites in remote locations throughout Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Most troubling was evidence suggesting that this network had continued to operate long after Thornwood's presumed death, with entries from associates dated as late as 1962. The discovery prompted a comprehensive review of unsolved cases in the region dating from the 1930s through the 1960s. A task force comprising representatives from multiple law enforcement agencies identified at least 47 disappearances or suspicious incidents that bore hallmarks consistent with Thornwood's methods. Many of the victims fit a pattern: individuals with questionable histories, drifters, or those engaged in behavior considered immoral by the standards of the time. In most cases, investigations had been cursory at best, with local authorities often seeming reluctant to pursue the matters too thoroughly. Forensic analysis of the samples found in the Helena archive yielded another disturbing revelation. In addition to vital human essence, many of the vials contained traces of various compounds, herbs, minerals, and synthetic substances that, when combined, created powerful natural compounds that could induce altered psychological states. This suggested that Thornwood's subjects were not only forced to consume essence, but were also given substances that would induce extreme psychological reactions. Experts consulted by the task force theorized that this chemical manipulation was integral to Thornwood's methodology, possibly intended to create a state of heightened suggestibility in which subjects would experience profound guilt and terror. The discovery of the Helena archive also shed new light on the fate of the graduate student who had attempted to research the Thornwood case in 1957 before abruptly abandoning his project. Among the materials was a file labeled Watkins Intervention, containing photographs of the student being followed and surveilled, along with transcripts of his phone conversations and copies of his research notes. The file concluded with a report describing a direct intervention in which unidentified individuals confronted the student and made explicit threats against him and his family. A handwritten note attached to the report stated, "Subject neutralized, research materials secured." Perhaps most chilling was the evidence suggesting that elements of Thornwood's network had infiltrated legitimate institutions. The archive contained lists of individuals in law enforcement, judicial positions, and local government who were identified as either active participants in Thornwood's organization or sympathetic to its aims. Some were marked with a small circle symbol, apparently indicating full initiation into what Thornwood called the ritual covenant. Others were designated as resources, individuals who could be relied upon to assist when necessary without being fully aware of the organization's true nature or extent. In 2016, following extensive examination of the Helena materials, federal authorities launched a quiet investigation into whether any aspects of Thornwood's network might still be operational. This investigation, codenamed Operation Legacy, focused particularly on rural areas in the Northwest, where unusual patterns of disappearances had been noted over the decades. While the findings remain classified, sources familiar with the operation indicated that several arrests were made, primarily of elderly individuals living in isolated locations who were found to possess materials directly linked to Thornwood's methodology. One case that received limited media attention involved a retired judge in his 80s who was discovered to have a hidden room in his remote hunting cabin containing items consistent with Thornwood's judgment chamber, restraints, collection vessels for essence, and a journal recording the processing of at least 7 individuals over a period of 20 years. When confronted by investigators, the judge reportedly showed no remorse, stating only that he had carried on the work when others had forgotten. He passed away while awaiting trial, taking with him whatever knowledge he possessed about the full extent of the organization's modern activities. In 2018, archaeologists were granted permission to conduct a limited excavation at the site of the former Maxwell estate. Ground-penetrating radar had indicated numerous anomalies consistent with burial sites across the property. The excavation uncovered evidence of at least 31 human burials, many showing signs of ritual significance. Bodies positioned in specific ways, surrounded by symbolic items, and in some cases, showing evidence of ante-mortem ceremonial practices. Forensic analysis suggested that the burials spanned a period from approximately 1920 to 1933, corresponding to the years of the Maxwell family's dominance in the area. These findings lent credence to Thornwood's claims about the Maxwell family's activities, suggesting that his initial allegations, however fantastical they may have seemed to Deputy Collins, had a foundation in truth. This raised profound questions about Thornwood's transformation. Was he, as many had assumed, a fundamentally good man, corrupted by his exposure to extreme evil, or had he recognized in the Maxwells a methodology that resonated with his own suppressed desires? The archaeological evidence could not answer this question, but it did establish that the Maxwells had indeed been engaged in ritual activities long before Thornwood's intervention. The Maxwell excavation also yielded an unexpected connection to the region's indigenous history. Several of the burial sites incorporated elements reminiscent of ancient rituals practiced by tribes that had inhabited the area centuries earlier. Consultation with indigenous scholars revealed that the Maxwell property encompassed what had once been considered a spiritually significant site associated with tribal justice ceremonies. This raised the possibility that Harold Maxwell had not invented his rituals, but had appropriated and perverted indigenous practices, perhaps after discovering artifacts or records on his property. This theory gained support when excavators uncovered a hidden chamber beneath the foundation of the main house, containing what appeared to be a collection of tribal artifacts and translated texts describing traditional ceremonies. In 2019, a documentary filmmaker named Sophia Chen gained access to previously unreleased portions of the Helena archive for a project examining the psychological aspects of the Thornwood case. Among the materials she reviewed was a series of interviews conducted with individuals who had encountered Thornwood during his time as sheriff. These accounts painted a more complex picture than the existing historical record, suggesting that even before the Maxwell incident, Thornwood had displayed concerning behaviors. Several witnesses described instances where he had detained individuals for minor infractions and subjected them to what he called moral instruction, lengthy sessions in which he would lecture them about their failings while requiring them to maintain stress positions or endure other forms of discomfort. Chen's research also uncovered a connection that had been overlooked by previous investigators. Before becoming sheriff, Thornwood had briefly worked as an orderly at the state mental hospital, the same institution to which he would later be committed. Employment records indicated that he had been dismissed after 6 months due to concerns regarding his methods of patient management, though the specific nature of these concerns was not documented. This early exposure to institutional confinement and control over vulnerable individuals may have influenced his later development of the Chamber of Justice concept. Most significantly, Chen discovered evidence suggesting that Thornwood's circle of judgment methodology had roots in esoteric philosophical texts to which he had been exposed during his military service. Among his personal effects seized after his arrest was a heavily annotated copy of an obscure 19th-century treatise on ritual justice by a German philosopher who argued that true moral reformation required a literal communion with one's victims. The text described a ritual remarkably similar to what Thornwood would later implement, in which wrongdoers were forced to consume essence as a means of absorbing the essence of those they had harmed, thereby achieving a form of cosmic balance. Chen's documentary, titled The Justice Sheriff, premiered at a small film festival in 2020, but was quickly withdrawn following legal challenges from several prominent Montana families who objected to her inclusion of materials suggesting their ancestors had been involved with Thornwood's network. While the legal battle continued, Chen reported receiving anonymous communications and experiencing unusual surveillance. In a podcast interview shortly before withdrawing from public view, she expressed her belief that elements of Thornwood's legacy remain active and powerful, particularly in rural communities where his blend of frontier justice and ritual still resonates with certain individuals. In 2021, a retired FBI agent named William Harrison published a memoir in which he devoted a chapter to his involvement in investigating what he termed ritual influences in American law enforcement. Without specifically naming Thornwood or his organization, Harrison described encountering multiple instances throughout his career where officers in isolated jurisdictions had established extra-legal systems of justice involving ritual elements and forced consumption of substances. He noted a particular concentration of such cases in the Northwest and attributed this pattern to the influence of a methodology that emerged in the 1930s and was passed down through informal networks. Harrison's memoir included a disturbing account of a 1974 investigation in a small Idaho county where the sheriff and several deputies had been systematically targeting individuals they deemed morally corrupt, primarily those involved in drug use or prohibited activities. The officers would arrest these individuals on minor charges, then subject them to purification sessions in which they were forced to consume mixtures containing their own vital essence, along with various herbs and chemicals. The sheriff reportedly told Harrison during questioning that he had been taught these methods by his predecessor, who had learned them from a righteous man who understood true justice. The publication of Harrison's memoir prompted renewed academic interest in what some scholars began referring to as ritual justice movements in American history. A 2022 conference at Montana State University brought together historians, criminologists, and religious studies experts to examine the Thornwood case within this broader context. Presenters identified several other instances throughout American history where frontier justice had incorporated ritualistic elements, suggesting that while Thornwood's methods were extreme, they existed on a continuum of extra-legal practices that emerged in isolated communities where formal legal systems were perceived as inadequate. One of the most compelling presentations at the conference came from Dr. Rachel Blackwood, a descendant of the county judge who had requested intervention during the height of Thornwood's power. Through family papers and local records, Dr. Blackwood had reconstructed the weeks following Thornwood's escape from the state hospital, a period poorly documented in official records. Her research indicated that Judge Blackwell had received multiple concerning letters warning him to honor the circle and remember his oath. More disturbing was evidence suggesting that after Thornwood's escape, a group of his followers had confronted the judge and subjected him to some form of ritual, after which he abruptly resigned his position and moved to California, never speaking of his experiences in Blackwater County again. In 2023, the ongoing digitization of historical newspapers revealed several accounts from small-town papers across the Northwest that had previously escaped researchers' notice. These articles, dating from 1937 to 1952, described isolated incidents bearing striking similarities to Thornwood's methods. Individuals found deceased with evidence of having consumed ceremonial substances, symbolic arrangements at scenes, and, in a few cases, cups or vessels placed nearby. Most of these incidents had been treated as isolated occurrences, with local authorities either unable or unwilling to connect them to a broader pattern. Particularly noteworthy was a series of articles from a weekly paper in northern Idaho describing the 1947 discovery of an abandoned cabin containing what the reporter called evidence of dark ceremonies. The cabin reportedly held a circular arrangement of chairs, each positioned above a symbol carved into the wooden floor, and a central table bearing 5 metal cups. Local authorities apparently dismissed the discovery as the work of eccentric squatters, but the similarities to Thornwood's described judgment circle are unmistakable. The property owner promptly burned the cabin to the ground, destroying any evidence that might have connected it definitively to Thornwood's network. In June 2023, an anonymous donor provided funding for a comprehensive DNA analysis of the remains discovered during the Maxwell property excavation. This analysis yielded several significant findings, including confirmation that at least 7 of the individuals buried on the property were among those listed as missing in county records during the years of Maxwell family control. More surprising was the discovery that 4 of the burials contained individuals with genetic markers consistent with the Maxwell family itself, suggesting that Harold Maxwell had not exempted his own kin from his ritualistic practices. The DNA analysis also established a direct genetic link between one of the unidentified remains and Sarah Jenkins, the former Maxwell housekeeper who had reported discovering the hidden room in the basement. Records indicated that Jenkins had a younger sister who disappeared in 1927, officially attributed to her running away with a traveling salesman. The confirmation that this sister had actually been among Maxwell's victims cast Jenkins' decision to remain silent about what she had witnessed in a new and tragic light, suggesting she may have been coerced into silence through threats to her own safety. In October 2023, a major breakthrough in understanding Thornwood's methodology came from an unexpected source. A history professor at the University of Wyoming discovered a collection of letters in the university archives that had belonged to Dr. Lawrence Chambers, the psychiatrist who evaluated Thornwood after his arrest. These personal communications, never intended for public view, contained Chambers' detailed observations and theories about Thornwood's psychological state, assessments too controversial to include in his official reports. In the letters, Chambers described Thornwood as exhibiting a unique form of delusional disorder, one in which his perception of justice had become so distorted that he genuinely believed he was absorbing both the sins and the essence of those he judged through the consumption of ritual substances. More disturbing was Chambers' observation that Thornwood displayed an ability to induce similar beliefs in others through a combination of charisma, manipulation, and what the psychiatrist termed ritualized conditioning. Chambers expressed particular concern about the deputies who had assisted Thornwood, noting that they showed signs of having been systematically indoctrinated into his worldview. Perhaps most significant was Chambers' documentation of Thornwood's detailed explanation of the circle of judgment concept during their sessions. According to these notes, Thornwood believed that conventional justice failed because it separated the judge from the judged, creating a moral distance that prevented true understanding. His alternative involved creating a literal circle in which all participants, the judge, the judged, and witnesses, were bound together through the sharing of essence, which he viewed as the physical carrier of moral qualities. In Thornwood's distorted logic, forcing the guilty to consume essence, particularly essence of those they had harmed or betrayed, created a closed circuit of justice in which escape was impossible. Chambers' letters also revealed that during his evaluation, Thornwood had spoken of establishing judgment circles throughout the country, describing a vision in which his methodology would eventually replace conventional legal systems entirely. He had apparently already begun this process before his arrest, sending trusted deputies to other communities to identify potential converts to his approach. Most concerning was Thornwood's claim that several individuals in positions of authority, including law enforcement officers, judges, and local officials, had already expressed interest in or actively adopted elements of his methodology. In December 2023, the Montana Historical Society completed the processing and cataloging of the Helena Archive materials, making them available to qualified researchers with appropriate clearances. This more systematic organization of the documents revealed patterns that had not been previously apparent, particularly regarding the geographic distribution of Thornwood's network. The materials included maps marking locations across the Northwest with small circular symbols, many corresponding to sites where suspicious incidents or disappearances had been reported over the decades. The archive also contained what appeared to be a membership roster of Thornwood's organization as it existed in 1936, shortly before his presumed death. The list included over 60 names, categorized by role and location, with many marked with annotations indicating their positions within legitimate institutions. Most disturbing was a section titled Generations, which outlined a plan for sustaining the organization over time through careful recruitment and mentorship, ensuring that as older members died or became inactive, younger individuals would be prepared to take their places. This long-term strategy may explain why elements of Thornwood's methodology continued to appear in criminal cases decades after his death. The organization he established was designed not as a cult dependent on his personal leadership, but as a self-perpetuating system of belief and practice that could adapt and evolve. This realization prompted researchers to reconsider cases as recent as the early 2000s, in which ritualistic elements reminiscent of Thornwood's approach had been observed but dismissed as the work of isolated individuals rather than manifestations of an organized tradition. In early 2024, the final piece of the Thornwood puzzle emerged when construction workers renovating a historic building in Butte, Montana, discovered a sealed wall cavity containing a metal box. Inside was a manuscript titled The Circle Completes, apparently written by Thornwood himself in late 1935. The document was immediately transferred to the Montana Historical Society, where preliminary authentication confirmed it as consistent with Thornwood's known handwriting and linguistic patterns. The manuscript provided Thornwood's own account of his activities following his escape from the state hospital, describing how he had established a hidden compound in the Bitterroot Mountains where he gathered followers and refined his methodology. He wrote of conducting judgments on individuals he deemed guilty of various moral offenses, detailing his rituals with a clinical precision that contrasted sharply with the evident satisfaction he took in their effectiveness. Most revealing was Thornwood's explanation of how his approach had evolved from his experiences with the Maxwell family. He acknowledged that his initial judgment of the Maxwells had been primarily motivated by conventional justice concerns, but claimed that, during the ritual, he had experienced what he described as a revelation, a profound sense that in forcing them to consume the essence, he had discovered a form of justice more fundamental and true than any human law. This experience had transformed his understanding of his role, convincing him that he had been chosen to introduce this method to a world he viewed as morally bankrupt. The manuscript concluded with Thornwood's plans for what he called the final judgment, an elaborate ritual he intended to perform on himself. He described how he had collected and preserved essence from each person he had judged, creating a composite that represented the sum of their transgressions. His ultimate act would be to consume this mixture, thereby taking all of their sins into himself and completing the circle he had begun with the Maxwells. Whether he actually carried out this final ritual remains unknown, though the explosion in the Bitterroot cabin in 1936 occurred shortly after the manuscript's apparent completion date. With the discovery of the Butte manuscript, the historical record of Sheriff Elias Thornwood and his Circle of Judgment is more complete than ever before, though significant gaps and questions remain. What is clear is that his impact extended far beyond the borders of Blackwater County and the years of his active involvement. The methodology he developed, a disturbing fusion of frontier justice, ritualistic elements, and psychological manipulation, created ripples that continued to influence isolated incidents and extremism for decades. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Thornwood case is how it illustrates the vulnerability of justice systems to corruption from within. Thornwood was not an outsider attacking legal institutions, but a duly appointed representative of the law who gradually twisted his authority into something unrecognizable. His ability to recruit others within the system, deputies, judges, and officials who either actively participated in or tacitly enabled his methods, demonstrates how the thin line separating justice from vengeance can blur when those entrusted with maintaining it become convinced that conventional approaches are inadequate. For the residents of Blackwater County and the broader region, the legacy of the sheriff who made the guilty drink the essence of their kin remains a shadow that never fully recedes. Local historical societies deliberately minimize references to Thornwood in their exhibits, and many families whose ancestors were involved, whether as perpetrators, victims, or witnesses, maintain a steadfast silence about those connections. Yet the story persists in local folklore, cautionary tales, and the persistent wariness with which some residents still regard law enforcement. In the end, the Thornwood case stands as a stark reminder of how justice, when divorced from humanity and due process, can become more terrible than the crimes it seeks to punish. The line between judging evil and embodying it proved too fine for Elias Thornwood to discern, a failing that transformed a man sworn to protect his community into something that community would spend generations trying to forget. And in remote corners of the Mountain West, when the wind blows cold through abandoned mining towns and isolated cabins, some still claim to hear the echo of metal cups being placed on wooden tables, and the voice of a man who believed that justice flows through the essence